Hello, and welcome to Bond Problems. It's evening where I am, and whatever you're doing, wherever you are, I hope that you find this particular video to be somewhat helpful in establishing the groundwork and foundation of the bond problems that we'll face in class. We address only very straightforward bond problems. Bonds are a lot more complex, a lot more complicated than we are able to address in class. But I think they're pretty interesting. We talked in class about the difference between stocks and bonds. Stocks are an equity investment, ownership of a company, and bonds are a debt instrument. It's a lending relationship. So when you own a bond, you possess a bond, the company owes you money and has promised to pay a series of dividends to you, and then a large lump sum at the end of the life of the bond, at the bond's maturity. Now, it could be that you purchased this bond directly from the company when they issued the bonds, or it could be that you bought a bond from someone else who had the bond. Bonds are bought and sold on the marketplace just like stocks are bought and sold. And the bond market is different than the stock market. It operates a little different. A debt instrument for the company. For you as a bondholder, you have to kind of watch interest rates because, as you'll see later in one of the future videos where we solve problems, the current interest rate drives the price of the bond, the price you can sell a bond for, so therefore its current value. And those are issues that we'll address in future videos. Today, all I want to do is set the foundation for the bond problems. And I'm going to do that by looking at a PowerPoint. I'm going to look at 3 slides. And these PowerPoint slides, 2 of the 3 of them anyway, not the first, but the last 2, can be found in the Chapter 5 slides that are posted on Canvas. The first one is simply a cash flow diagram that I use to illustrate the bond problems in general. I've also learned with this technology that when I share my screen with you, if I then go full screen, everything goes nuts. So, excuse me, I will be sharing with you a PowerPoint slide, but it won't be a slideshow, so it looks a little goofy. I don't like that. But that's what we're stuck with the technology that I am intelligent enough to use. So let me start off by describing the bonds, and then we'll look at a cash flow diagram and then get a little more specific. They promise to pay. The owner of the bond purchases the bond for a certain amount of money, and then the bond issuer will pay the bondholder predefined regular uniform cash flows for a period of time up to the maturity date of the bond. And at that time, the bond issuer will pay the bondholder what's called the face value of the bond. Think of a bond as look at it like a bill, like a $1 bill or a $5 bill or a $10 bill. When you look at a $5 bill, it has a 5 on it, which tells you the value of it. That's the face value of that bill, that currency. A bond, when they used to print bonds, and when you bought one, you had a paper bond. These bonds have a face value printed on them. And so that face value never changes for the bond. That is That is the lump sum payment that is received at the maturity date of the bond. The maturity date is printed on the bond, so that can't change. And the dividend or coupon or bond rate, those three terms being the same thing, that is also printed on the bond, so that never changes. And that dictates those regular uniform periodic payments that the bondholder receives over time. So let me share my screen and let's look at the cash flow diagram first for a bond. Okay, there it is. Every bond problem has the same cash flow diagram. They're all the same, just like this. And this is it. V sub n is the purchase price or value of the bond at time 0. That is when the bond is purchased. R times Z, the value R times Z, we'll talk more about these values in the next slide, is the periodic uniform dividend payment that you receive, the bondholder receives from the bond. And you can notice I didn't put the letters here, but there's a little arrow right here. And so there's an R times Z amount. At the very end, this is the maturity date of the bond, perhaps. And at that time, you also get this lump sum payment of Z. Z is the face value of the bond, or C, and we'll distinguish between those two here in just a little bit. So when we look at this cash flow diagram, the letters R and Z are fixed. They are both printed on the bond, so we know exactly what these cash flows will be. V is not printed on the bond. That's the price of the bond, and that's what the holder of the bond would pay for the bond. And the C is a special case for what you would get if perhaps you sold the bond early. Then the C might be different than the Z, the face value of the bond. And again, we address that in a problem 2 videos from now. So this is the cash flow diagram. If I'm going to sell my bond, whoever buys my bond will have exactly the same cash flow diagram that they're looking at. So the only difference might be the length of time, the length of time I owned it versus the length of time that the next bond holder might own this particular bond. So let's look at the next slide here. This gets into some definitions, and it shows us what our bond equation is. So the commercial value of a bond is the present worth of all future net cash flows expected to be received. And those future net cash flows are the periodic dividend, that's the face value Z times the bond rate R, and the redemption price C, which might be Z. I know it's a little confusing right now. I'll discuss that more in a minute. All discounted to the present at the bond's yield rate. So this is something new here, the yield rate. Here's the bond equation. This bond equation, there's only one bond equation. Every problem we work follows the same bond equation. Now, how we solve them might not look like we're using that bond equation, but it's always the same bond equation. The value of the bond, this is the price that the bond owner would pay. This is the value at time 0, 0 being the time when that holder acquires a bond, is equal to, here's the redemption. This is the value that the bondholder receives at the end of his or her ownership of the bond, times P given F. So this is a single value in the future. We're bringing it back to the present. P given F, I% n periods. So this V sub n is the value of the bond with n dividend periods remaining. So there's our n dividend periods. Plus R times E, this is the dividend amount, the bond rate times the face value of the bond times P given A. Remember, this is a uniform periodic amount times P given A, I percent N. I percent is the yield rate. This represents what the bondholder will earn in terms of a rate of return on the bond. There's a lot of people not informed about bonds, just believe that if you own a 5% bond, that is the bond rate's 5%, that that's what you earn on the bond. Well, that 5% does represent the periodic payments, but it's not necessarily what you earn. You can earn more on the bond by paying less for the bond. So if your investment is less, the return you receive is more. If your investment is greater, then the return you receive might be less. So the owner of a 5% bond could be earning, their yield could be greater than 5% or less than 5%. And the example problems that we'll see in future videos will demonstrate that, and I believe it'll become more clear to you. So that's the one bond equation. And what we do in bond problems is we solve for one of the variables. And the truth is, there may be only 3 key variables here, because Z never changes, R never changes. And at any point in time, N is fixed. So the only things that we can solve for in this equation are V, the price of the bond, or we could solve for the yield, the rate of return for the bond, or we could solve for a price to sell the bond for. If we wanted to sell it before the maturity date, we could determine, based on what we paid for it and what yield we wanted, we could determine what we should sell it for. Finally, let's look at a very brief bond example. What is the value of a 6% 10-year bond? 6%, that's the bond rate, or the coupon rate. 10-year bond with a par and redemption value of $20,000. Let's pause again here. Par value is the same as face value. Again, I'm sorry for the elegant variation, more than one word meaning the same thing. But the face value of the bond and the par value of a bond are the same. Value of $20,000. So this is a $20,000 bond. That is, it has on its face $20,000. It pays its dividends semi-annually. Okay, we've got to keep that in mind. So our dividends are paid every 6 months, twice a year. And then the other qualifiers, if the purchaser wishes to earn an 8% return. Whenever we see these interest rates in a bond problem, they're given as annual nominal rates. So the 6% bond rate is an annual nominal rate, and the 8% is an annual nominal rate. Our yield is the 8%. So we can fill in the bond equation. We want to find out the value of the bond. So we're solving for V sub n. It's equal to $20,000, which is our redemption value. It's the face value of the bond. If we're going to keep this bond to maturity, that's 10 years down the road. So it's $20,000 times P given F. So we'll move the $20,000 back to time 0. 4%. Now, where does the 4% come from? Well, remember, the interest rate inside the interest formula, the functions we have here, is the yield. And our yield is 8%. But remember, semi-annual. Once the dividends are paid semi-annually, or whatever period it is, if it's quarterly or if it's annually, that drives our problem. So now everything must be done at a semi-annual basis. So 4% divided by 2 gives us, 8% divided by 2 gives us 4%. That's our yield every 6 months. And N is 20. And it's 20 because, again, we have 10 years to go, but the dividends are paid every 6 months. So there are 20 bond dividend paying periods to maturity. Then we add the annual part, or in this case, the 6-month part, the periodic dividend payments. The first number here, 0.03, 3%, that's 1/2 of the bond rate of 6%, 3% times the face value of the bond, $20,000, times P given A, 4%, again, half of the desired annual yield for 20 dividend paying periods. And we can figure all this out. We didn't do the Excel functions. We'll do that in the next 2 videos. We find out that the value of this bond to this purchaser is $17,282. How does that work? That means that this purchaser, with 10 years left on this bond, will purchase a 6% 10-year bond, $20,000 face value that pays dividends every 6 months. And the purchaser will pay $17,000 for this bond that will pay $600, that's the semi-annual amount, every 6 months for the next 10 years, and give the purchaser $20,000 at the end of those 10 years. So the purchaser's paying below par, we would say. The purchaser pays below par, and that indicates that the purchaser will earn more than the bond rate. If the purchaser pays less than par, then the yield is greater than the bond rate. There are situations where the purchaser would pay more than the par value, and the yield would be less than the bond rate. If you have a very attractive bond and there are no other good investments around, someone just might do that. Again, we explain that in a future video. This is fundamentally how bonds work. So that's the introductory material. I hope it was somewhat helpful. I think you'll find that the future 2 videos, on one video, bond problems, simple bond problems, and on the last bond video, we solve one bond problem, but we solve it different ways to answer different sorts of questions. And we get into some of the more complicated issues that I alluded to here at the end with respect to selling a bond. What is your yield? How do you find that? Things like that. Again, these are really, in the grand scheme of things, simple bond problems, all of them, but they will give you a little bit of a flavor about investing in bonds. I hasten to add here that as we watch what's going on in the economy these days, and as interest rates start to climb up, it won't be good for current bondholders, because as those interest rates climb, their bonds will be worth a little bit less on the market than they are now. And you'll understand as you look at these solutions to bond problems how that all works out. So you have these 3 bond problem videos, and then you have there's a chapter 5 summary video. If you have a need to look at that, it's the material we looked at on the Wednesday before spring break. And then there are, I believe, 3 chapter 6 videos that lay the foundation for us for when I get back after the week after spring break, and you'll be able to see what's coming up in Chapter 6. So I hope you're having a good break already. Make sure, again, that you don't break anything. And I look forward to being back with you again. Take care.